and welcome to Varn Blog. Today I am with Dr. Annie McClanahan, the author of Beneath the Wage, Tips, Tasks, and Gigs in the Age of Service Work, and priorly, Dead Pledges, Debt Crisis in the 21st Century Culture. Dr. McClanahan is Associate Professor of English at University of California, Irvine, where she works on American literature, political economy, and labor. Three things often not linked together. And your new book caught my interest because it's something I've been thinking about since probably 2012, actually. But I have unfortunately stumbled into Twitter debates about whether or not service workers counted as workers, and then did some research myself on the debates around that going all the way back to the 19th century, including some very strange but somewhat interesting letters by Marx where he goes back and forth on what to categorize service workers, including coming up with a second category of lumpen proletariat that he doesn't think is true lumpen proletariat to apply to service workers because in the 19th century they were seasonally precarious and often out of work. Your current research really seems to indicate that we kind of have to update this, considering that industrial labor is, I don't know, between 8 and 12%, depending on how you categorize it in the Bureau of Labor Statistics of the entire workforce. And service work is between 60 and 80%, depending on how you categorize services. So what got you interested in this question?
Yeah, so thanks so much. That's a great intro. And I think it's really good for folks to be reminded that although it seems kind of crazy that we would still be having debates about whether service workers are part of the working class or not, we are in some spaces, and those are very old debates. So I think, yeah. So, I mean, one thing that got me interested in this is that it's interesting to hear you say that you've been thinking about this since 2012, because that's about when I started thinking about it too. And my first book is about debt and consumer credit, and about how with the wage stagnation that happens as a result of deindustrialization, workers end up turning to debt in order to make it possible for them to reproduce themselves and their households and their families, right? And so I think in some ways of this book as like sort of the sequel to that book, because I'm interested in the ways in which that phenomenon of wage stagnation is related to the rise of the service economy, and to the ways that workers increasingly struggle to reproduce themselves in a service-driven economy, and the rise of particularly like employment formations like gig work as a sort of way to compensate for the fact that workers are not earning enough in their full-time jobs. So that was partly what got me interested in this. I'm also very interested in those longer histories, the ones that you were evoking that go back to the 18th and 19th century, and to the sort of failure of political economy in that period to take seriously this class of workers. I mean, one interesting thing is that, like, you know, we tend to say, I tend to say, like, well, we have to update this understanding of service work, given that we are in an economy where roughly 80% of the workforce is doing services providing work. But actually that was also true in the 19th century. Like, there's a moment in Capital where Marx says, like, oh yeah, by the way, the number of domestic servants in England in this period is more than the number of all workers in textiles, metals, manufacturing, and mining combined. But they still don't really count. And so it was also true in the 19th century that you have a massive class of domestic servants in that period, performing these kinds of work that have a complex relationship to the question of productivity. Again, this becomes even more relevant in the present because so much of the workforce is doing this kind of work.
Yeah, I think this is what got me thinking about it too, because at first I was looking at the post Great Recession economy, and I had left the country because of the post Great Recession economy, and I was trying to figure out, like, okay, there's all this focus on industrial labor, even if it came back, and in fact the idea that it completely left is actually somewhat of a misunderstanding. Um, you're not going to have mass industrial employment, and in fact, I mean, there was already the whole revision crisis in the 1920s was the realization that industrial employment, even in the most intensely industrialized society in Europe, Germany at the time, was not hitting 50% employment rate in the industrial sector. And it like caused a crisis. Like that's what the revision, that's the initial impetus for the revisionism crisis, not even the political calculation stuff. And um and I was like, well, it seems like Marx is somewhat inconsistent on this, because there are times where he does categorize service workers as workers. Particularly one of the examples he gives in Theories of Surplus Value is teachers working for a private school being productive to surplus capital. But he seems to just not want to deal with it because the entire wage form exploitation thing is harder to apply to service workers, because the fixed and variable capital problems, to get, not to bore the crap out of my audience, but the fixed and variable capital problems are different because there's only so much productivity you can possibly get in a service, even with technological help. So one person can only cut one person's hair at a time. They might get faster at it, but they can't do 20. Now, your book had me thinking about part of the problem is not just this productivity issue, but also that like the wage form is treated as the baseline of understanding both exploitation and who counts as a worker. And service workers have always had a stranger relationship to the wage form, as they do depend on it. It is usually roughly a major component of their income, but it has never been all the income. And sometimes it's not even most of their income. And so your book really focuses on all the stuff that's like sub wage, which is a piece rate platform task, which I also find interesting because some more research in the 19th century, I realized that was even true for industrial workers back then. Like,
Absolutely. Yeah. It's an hourly wage is an entirely 20th century phenomenon, and we completely forget that.
right. And then tips, and then algorithmic gig work, which is even weirder because that doesn't really have a prior parallel. If the standard wage really isn't a good organizing principle for the vast majority of the working class, how do we understand like who counts and what is class consciousness now?
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's a great question. So, I mean, I think like, one thing that my book is sort of trying to do is it's trying to say, on the one hand, look, I mean, exactly as you said, it makes sense that particularly 19th century political economy cannot quite accommodate this particular kind of work into its understanding of what capitalist exploitation looks like, because it is so different from industrial work. It's not centralized. It can't be subject to the same forms of sort of scientific management and rationalization. To some extent, it can, but not in the same way industrial labor can. It's not particularly mechanized. It tends to be informal. Its output tends to be highly variable. It tends to be work that you have to do in person. It's difficult to outsource it, right? And you can't automate it anything like the way that a technology like the assembly line can increase the productivity of industrial labor. So in all these ways, it's very different, right? As the 20th century progresses, it becomes different in another way, which is that it's largely unregulated or underregulated. So it's not subject to minimum hours, maximum hours, and minimum wage regulations. So one conclusion you could draw from that is like, well, we can't really understand service work as a form of capitalist labor. And that is the conclusion of a lot of thinkers from the 18th century to the mid 20th, at least, and even to some extent today, which is that it has this sort of fundamentally like anachronistic or non-modern or non-capitalist quality. And so you'll often hear people describe it as like a servant economy, right? So even if we're talking about 21st century labor, we're still using this sort of 18th century paradigm to understand it. That's one solution. The other solution is to say, well, maybe we actually need to update our understanding of capitalist labor processes in order to accommodate this kind of work, which, as you said, right, has always been a key to the mode of accumulation, right? Whether we imagine it's directly productive of value or not, it's definitely been around and it's been significant. And these workers have often been a kind of radical faction in labor organizing. Um, and the reason that I think the reason that I think that that conclusion is important is because you can also see it from the other side, which is that when we have theorized service work, we have largely not paid attention to its labor process. And so we haven't allowed it to sort of like reformulate or transform these categories that we've derived mostly from industrial labor, because instead we've seen it as emotional work, we've seen it as affective labor, we've seen it as immaterial labor. And those are useful theories to some extent. I think they're limited, but they're useful in a lot of ways. But they're not going to tell us anything about how exploitation works in this sector, how direct domination works, the extent to which some amount of de-skilling and rationalization scientific management does happen, especially in the 21st century with the rise of platform labor, et cetera, right? And it also doesn't allow us to see the ways in which the differences between this kind of work and industrial work have often been attached to race and gender and citizenship status and perceived ability, right? And so I think like to me, it's like most valuable to use the category to like completely rethink the assumptions that we have both about what working class leverage looks like and what working class exploitation looks like and what capitalist labor sort of as a broad category looks like and what the sort of key features of that labor are.
Hmm. One of the things this really gets me thinking about is the difficulty of unionizing small shop services in particular. Like it's somewhat easier with large shop services, by that I mean like medical work, teachers, but because they still have a quasi-industrial space, sort of. But there's large concentrations of workers in a singular area. But and I think we saw this in the second half of the aught teens when there was a movement to start unionizing service work, which has been historically pathetically unionized, like I think like 2% or something like that. But lack of dependence on the wage fund and lack of a centralized workplace seems to have been an organizing block, at least using the models of early 20th century shop unions. How much did this affect your thinking about this, and what like maybe we should start thinking about and approaching organizing service workers and whatnot?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's like a couple things to say. One is that if you look at the history of service work and service worker unions, there's actually a lot of really inspiring examples, you know, from say roughly the mid 20th century of service workers combating exactly those conditions, right? Small employers, great degree of decentralization, et cetera, by developing forms of union strategy and union organization that look different than the industrial unions that are the dominant force of labor politics in that period, right? So just to give two examples, the Domestic Workers Union, the DWU, in the beginning in the 30s and 40s and really up through the mid 20th century becomes this really radical site of like what we might today call like relational unionism or bargaining for the common good unionism. And that's dealing with an incredibly decentralized labor force, which is like private domestic servants doing often day labor in homes like across New York City. Similarly, the amazing feminist labor historian Dorothy Cobble has written about waitresses unions throughout the 20th century and the way that they develop what she calls occupational unionism, right? Where like you're say, for instance, like protecting job security even when a worker moves from one employer to another in the same occupational sector, right? So waitresses that might sort of move jobs but still remain in the occupation, trying to fight for some degree of job security and wage security in that context. And I mean, Cobble has pointed out, for instance, more recently that like that model of occupational unionism could be very easily applied to contemporary gig worker organizing. So I think it's less about like saying, okay, these are groups of workers that are impossible to organize, as has sometimes been said, but more saying like they're groups of workers whose working conditions require new forms of organizing and new ways of understanding it. And if you think about like where most of the sort of most powerful union campaigns in the last couple decades have been, they have been largely in service worker unions, mostly in public sector service workers, right? So teachers, nurses, et cetera. Uh, in sort of like semi-professionalized portions of the service working class, like workers organized again via AFT or the nurses unions or AFSCME. So again, public sector workers. Um, but also in some cases, like lower wage service workers, like the workers organized by Unite here. So to some extent, like the strongest union campaigns of the last couple decades have been in that sector, and often those campaigns have suggested that far from having less leverage than manufacturing workers or industrial workers, service workers potentially have more leverage when they can organize regionally, right? So, for instance, like a labor stoppage among teachers has like an immense and immediate impact on the regional economy, right? Because parents can't work. And so labor stoppages by teachers, labor stoppages by childcare providers, by healthcare providers, they can have immense ripple effects on the community, in ways that sort of suggest that the common claim made by sort of proponents of like reindustrialization, right, would suggest that like, oh, service workers can't possibly achieve this kind of leverage, but that's not actually true. You just have to think about leverage in slightly different ways.
So I am greatly interested in this question because I've been thinking about that too. It's just like I think, of course, we can organize these different areas, but we have to completely change the model of organization. One thing that comes up to me though is that I think it was in the mid aughts I started seeing this sector kind of subdivided. I mean, now it's subdivided in some really strange ways because there's all these PMC debates. I'm going to bracket that out for now. I don't want to get into that. But you started hearing about emotional labor, invisible labor, and then the precariat. Um, do you think any of these categories are really helpful for understanding this broad phenomenon? Are they limitedly helpful? And if so, uh, how do you think they've limited understanding of studying and trying to aid in organizing these sectors of the economy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, I think like the proliferation of categories to understand these phenomena to the extent that they're new, is really can be really useful. I think like we need categories to sort of tease out these ideas. Ultimately, I think the emotional labor or effective labor stuff is good insofar as it allows us to think about, for instance, like what does it mean to perform a kind of work where the commodity is intangible,
Mhm.
or can't be resold, right? Like to use your haircut example, like if somebody gives me a haircut, I can't go out and resell that haircut on the market, right? It's not detachable from either the body of the customer or the body of the service worker themselves, right? So I think the emotional labor stuff is useful for getting at what is complex about that kind of work, and it's also useful for getting at the relationship between service work and feminization, right? Why is it that these kinds of work where the worker is often being called upon to either perform or produce affective states often is work that gets ascribed to women? Like there's obviously a long history of that the Marxist feminist tradition helps us think through really capaciously. Where I think that category kind of runs aground, though, is, as I said, it tends to focus mostly on like what workers are doing rather than the conditions under which they're doing it. And then it loses this opportunity for us to think about service work using these categories that we all have always used to understand industrial work, right? So wages, management, mechanization, regulation, organization. All of those get sort of like erased when we look at service work solely through this paradigm of like affective or emotional labor. And the other thing that happens, and this is particularly something that happens in Arlie Hochschild's work. And of course, she's, it's from her that we derive so much of this theory. Even today, even 30 years after the publication of her book, it still has so much, takes up so much space in our understanding of these categories. Here, I mean her book, The Managed Heart, which is about the labor of Delta flight attendants. Um, but Hochschild basically says like service workers are subject to a specific and a very intensive kind of delusion that they believe the emotions that they're called upon to perform. And to me, that really like misses the mark when it comes to, again, seeing service workers as like very aware and canny about their own class position, very aware and canny about their own exploitation. And again, often a radical faction in labor movements. Like even the flight attendants, right? Like she describes them as if they're subject to this like sort of particularly pernicious form of false consciousness. But if you look at the like labor militancy and flight attendant unions over the last, 4 decades, like that's totally not borne out by the truth. And it's not, and the emphasis on affective performance doesn't allow us to understand the ways in which like flight attendants have fought for things like banning tobacco on airplanes because it was so devastating to their health. They fought for things like payment for the time that passengers take to board the plane. So raising all these questions about like time and the wage form in service work, about efficiency in service work, right? Again, things that we will not understand if we solely are looking at the fact that they smile when they bring you a Coke, right? And I think that that's one of the limits of that particular category.
Hmm. Um, what about the precariat? Because that was a big one about 15
Yeah.
years ago.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I'm not sure why. I mean, I think it's a useful category. I mean, I like that it sort of reminds us of the generative quality of the term proletariat, right? Which like has
Mhm.
increasingly, I think, become a term that people are using in lieu of the phrase working class, because working class does, I think, for many folks, like sort of suggest this kind of like 19th century metonymy whereby like the white, mostly male industrial worker sort of stands in for the class as a whole. And I think people have felt that proletariat was more capacious than that, and that thus precariat sort of like speaks back to that tradition. It's very useful as a way of understanding insecurity and understanding insecurity across a wide range of both labor sectors and labor processes.
Mm.
Um, and it's useful for understanding the ways in which like independent contractor status as a legal category is increasingly important to the way that the service economy functions. That is not a category that is new to the 21st century in the way that like some of these accounts sometimes seem to imply. It's an old category with an old legal history, a legal history that in fact dates back to the management of domestic servants in the 18th and 19th centuries. Um, so but I do think it's useful for sort of like reminding us of the importance of that concept. But it does seem to me as if people are using that term, that specific term, slightly less now, and using instead a term like gig worker, which is maybe a little bit more specific than precariat.
Yeah. My only objection to precariat historically was like, okay, but it's not new though. It's basically
Yeah.
the primary form of proletarian employment
Yes.
for like most of the 19th century, most of the 18th century, uh,
Yeah.
most of developing worlds in the 20th century. I mean, like the period of formal industrial hourly
Yeah.
employment is remarkably small, actually, in the history of
It's a
employment.
total exception. It's a total exception. And it's wild the way in which, like, so much, I mean, again, even now, 5 decades into deindustrialization, so many theories take the regulated formal hourly wage paid to manufacturing workers on the basis of productivity, which can be enhanced by machines, as the norm. And it's really important that we understand why it's not the norm, because whereas in the US you have this like, and in Europe and in much of the rest of the overdeveloped world, you have this like very clear sort of tripartite trajectory where you go from, informal, sort of maybe proto-industrial agricultural labor to industrial labor to a service economy. And because you have that middle phase of industrialization, you develop this whole infrastructure of like regulated wages and labor reforms that come solely as a result of industrial labor. But in underdeveloped economies where where they're often skipping that industrialized phase and basically moving directly from agriculture to services, they have not developed anything like a regulatory infrastructure because that comes only with a certain kind of industrial hegemony, right? And so if we don't understand that, the sort of exceptional status of that kind of work and that kind of relationship between the state and capital, then we're not going to understand at all what's happening outside of the overdeveloped world, particularly in the last, 3, 4, 5 decades.
Mm. This gets me to a point that ties back to your first book, but you talked about the way that, particularly after neoliberalization in the 70s and 80s, capital actually had to force wages down relative to costs so much that you had a stealth social reproduction problem. And so you had debt spending expand to the point that you almost can't imagine a modern functional commercial economy without massive levels of debt. But I've also pointed out that's actually relative. That's actually really new. That's really a post 60s phenomenon. How do you think these things relate? And I want to give a couple of examples, so we don't just focus on like the algorithmic gig work. But one of the things I noticed about the time I left the United States in 2009, before I came back in 2017, was that a lot of jobs, even before this automated algorithmic gig work phenomenon happened, that were clearly would have been under hourly labor before. So a lot of doctor's offices in my small town in Macon, Georgia, it was not that small, but started moving to turning all of their aides from hourly employees to contractors, to get out of basically paying them benefits. And the other thing that I started seeing, and this really expanded and was exacerbated when I came back to the United States, is between when I left and when I came back, not only did tipping percentages need to increase to make up for the fact that minimum wage hasn't gone up for service workers since, I don't know, the 90s, maybe even earlier than that. It's been a long time. When it did go up a little bit in 2009, servers were exempted and they were still at the half rate of the 1990s rate. But what I started seeing when I came back to the States was tipping expanded to other services that you didn't historically associate it with. So you associate it with like tattoo artists and estheticians and stuff like that. But like, I would go to a concert and buy a record, and the person selling me the record would be so low compensated that they would ask for a tip. I'd never seen that before. So how has the contraction of debt, or the inability to expand debt, although it's been expanding, but it's actually, how has that affected these other forms of compensation as a way of trying to offset the limits of the wage fund? I mean, I guess the other thing that I just want to point out is historical knowledge. We'd already have the wage fund shrink dramatically in the 60s and 70s, which is why you had the end of the household wage, as limited and patriarchal as it was, turn into the 2-income household. But now that you socially reproducing yourself on the median income as an individual anyway, and most of the US is pretty difficult. So how has that affected things, and how has the change in debt affected that?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the like another sort of story that I sometimes tell about the starting why I got interested in this book is because in writing this book is because a number of years ago I had this very weird fellowship where they basically pay you or fund you to take extensive coursework in a completely other discipline. And so I had this fellowship where I took a year and a half of coursework in microeconomics because I was at the time interested in the sort of intellectual history of microeconomics. And I was in a class on corporate welfare, and we were doing like basically like pretty basic calculations around wages and like reservation wages and efficiency wages. And the professor kept noting that from the perspective of microeconomics, the guaranteed hourly wage is like completely irrational. Like economists, basically, like mainstream economists, orthodox economists, think that it's unbelievably stupid that you would guarantee someone a certain amount of money regardless of their output or their sort of success at the job, right? They vastly prefer performance-based pay or payment by results. And that got me curious again, because I think that so many of us, particularly if you haven't worked in the service sector, but sometimes even people who have, like they just take the hourly wage as this kind of given. But if you go back to Marx, and this sort of comes back to something that you mentioned before about piece rate, if you go back to Marx, Marx actually says like, okay, yeah, piece rate is like the method of wage payment that is like most common in capitalism. It was certainly the most common form of wage payment in the 19th century, and it's common in virtually any sector where machines themselves can't be set to guarantee the output. So the reason that we get the hourly wage in the 20th century is basically because we also get the assembly line. And with the assembly line, you can say like, okay, the effort that it takes to produce 20 widgets in a day doesn't matter because the assembly line is just going to go at the speed that produces 20 widgets and you just have to keep up. So instead of having some people who are producing 15 and some people who are producing 25, everybody is producing 20. So you can pay everybody the same wage. Obviously, as we've already talked about, like that doesn't really work in service work, right? So the reason that tips and piece rate and various forms of payment by results tend to dominate in service work is because you don't have the same kind of like time discipline. You don't have the same sort of regularity of output. One of the debates about tipping in when they're trying to decide whether or not to regulate it in the 1960s and subject it to the sort of regular hourly wage is that like if you're waiting tables, like as the term suggests, a lot of your time is spent waiting. You're not actually working. You're waiting for people to finish. You're waiting to bring the food. You're waiting to clear the plates, etc. Right? Same thing is true of gig work. Gig workers also spend a lot of time waiting. Drivers spend a lot of time waiting. So in these sectors, these other non-hourly forms of payment, like tips, come to dominate. But tips actually do a second thing in addition to having this capacity to sort of like control output and become like basically a form of self-management, right? Like payment by results means you don't have to have a manager because you're self-managing because you're trying to earn a certain amount, right? So, but tips do a third thing in addition to those other two things, which is that they offload the labor cost onto the customer. And so exactly as you said, like as sort of wage pressures in the service sector get more intense in the 21st century, and as you have more and more problems with people quitting, particularly like in the sort of post-COVID period, right? Firms are required to find ways to ensure that their workers are making enough money without the firm itself having to pay for that, right? And so again, the wage burden gets offloaded to customers who often, paradoxically, are themselves service workers in other places, right? And so you basically have a situation where service workers are paying a significant portion of the wage to other service workers, which means that everybody's reproductive costs go up because the cost of getting a coffee or getting a beer or getting a haircut or buying a meal goes up for the worker, right? And the firm is depending ever more on that to pay the wages of the workers for the firm. And so I think like there's something potentially like very interesting there where you have these sort of relations of like what E.P. Thompson would call like moral economy, right? Economists are also fascinated by tipping because they think it's like fundamentally irrational, right? Like, why do we tip? Like, why do I feel obliged if I'm not being compelled to pay a tip of 15 or 20 or 25%? Why do I do it, right? Economists find that like really bizarre because it seems to run against all of their theories of like human behavior and human rationality. So, but to me, what it suggests is that we have this sense of like some kind of moral obligation or sort of sense of solidarity with others. Everybody knows that the best tippers are people who have worked or are working in tip jobs themselves. So there's something really politically interesting happening there, even though it's also this form of like super exploitation and exactly as you said, a way to shift a portion of the wage fund back onto consumers.
Right. So basically, to to think about this, because I one of the things I will say when I moved around the world for 10 years, and I was in Mexico, which also has a heavy tipping economy for like pretty much everything. And one of the things you'd hear economists complain about first is like, oh, it's a sign of low social trust and corruption. And I'm like, well, that's interesting, because if it's totally a sign of low social trust and corruption, why would the average person do it?
Yeah.
Which is not me valorizing tipping. I would love for everyone to get paid a suitable wage, but um, it does seem very hard to reproduce without massive amounts of service inflation, which is going to happen anyway, but it's going to be worse if you don't offset this with tips, if you're still trying to keep profit rates relatively high. Um, so I was thinking about this, and I've been thinking about your kind of like three, let's call them archetypes of models of this, because they're not really separate classes. They're not even entirely distinct sectors in all cases, but um, you kind of lay out the tip service worker, old, very long standing thing, the clerical micro worker, and like piecemeal or contract worker or independent contractors, all kinds of things you might call them. Um, but for examples of who they might be, that's both like white collar temp workers, but also like adjunct professors who are
Yeah.
uh, yeah. I occasionally get mad at tenure because I'm like, tenure's not possible in this current system without getting rid of all this admin, because of massive armies of people who are paid sub minimum wage.
Yeah.
Um, but anyway, and then gig workers, which the reason why I brought up the contractization in other fields though is I don't think we think of like things that used to be hourly service work um being transitioned to gig work because of an independent contractor status, but like structurally it's the same thing.
Yeah.
Um
Yeah.
uh so one thing you'll point out though is structurally these workers do face different forms of management depending on what role they're in at any given time. And like we said, some people are doing all of these actually, and some
Yeah.
people have roles that go back and forth between all of these, but uh they all actually in some ways require intensive management, but it's quite different. So like emotional labor is managed quite different from algorithmic policing
Yeah.
of work. um how do you think this difference in management changes the material experience of the work, and what does that do to like workers' sense of their relation to other workers? Because the assumption seems to be that it totally breaks down solidarity. I'm not sure that's true, but I do think it has to look different.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and I mean you can see a lot of this in the sort of history of like where independent contractor status comes from. Like the word independent is meant to connote workers who are not subject to the immediate scrutiny of management, right? To the direct control. And so if you look at the history of how we determine who's an independent contractor and who's an employee, that mostly has to do with like this concept that's developed in the 19th century called the control test, which again has to do with whether or not a boss is telling you what to do, when to do it, how to do it, et cetera, right? Versus workers who are perceived to have some more autonomy, right? And this persists well up into the 21st century with the rise of the gig economy. Those same conditions still apply. And when there are often worker led movements to sort of change those definitions to keep up with what a 21st century economy looks like, the companies themselves fight them and try to keep this very old sort of 18th century version because that is serves their interests best, right? Um, and then this raises all of these interesting questions like for workers themselves, because, and it's something that I'm trying to think through in the gig work chapter, and I don't know that I ultimately have like a total answer to it, but how do we say on the one hand that this idea of independence and autonomy and like being your own boss is like a fiction, it's a lie that's cooked up by the companies in order to justify the low wages and incredibly vulnerable status of these workers, right? It serves their interests entirely. And yet, on the other hand, does in fact reflect a real desire among workers themselves to be autonomous, to not have a boss, to have some degree of control, to have some degree of flexibility over their schedule, right? Like things that many people want in their work, that are real and real desires and real demands. And so partly what I'm trying to think through in that chapter is just like, what would it mean to sort of hold both of these things in our head at once, right? Which is the fact that this status, this sort of informalized status, is immensely exploitative on the one hand, and the fact that it is understandable that it has been a little bit hard for worker organizations to persuade workers to give up the freedom that they understand to come with that category. And so I'm interested in thinking about how workers' organizations and unions among gig workers have sort of thought through this dilemma.
Yeah. That is interesting to me, because I do think you hit on, to use a terrible Marxist word, dialectic contradiction, but uh I'll use a normal word, a paradox of um where the position a lot of these gig work service area, workers have, in that you have, to some degree, the feeling of independence, but you also are geographically isolated from other workers in ways that I do think makes the easy traditional union model very hard to enact. You have to change it, because even though you had Taylorist, Bentham prison like panopticon conditions in the factory, which I think people forget, but you really did. um, People were still able to organize historically because of their proximity to one another, even if they were doing it super on the DL, particularly in the 19th and early 20th century. Um, uh, I'm interested though in this freedom that you can have doing gig work. I know a lot of people who do like it for that reason, because you can set your own hours. You're not going to get called in at a weird time, kinda. However, you also talk about the increasing pressures of algorithmic monitoring and algorithmic assignments, which actually make a lot of that independence really
Yeah.
questionable, because you can get deprioritized in the algorithm and not get work, and people start to learn that, and then they start being disciplined by the algorithm in a way that may feel like self-discipline but isn't. um
Yeah.
how much do you think that's changing the perception of gig work amongst gig workers themselves?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's exactly right. And I mean, one of the histories that I tell in the book is about the way that those techniques get first developed in the management of long haul trucking, which is like, if you look at the history of workplace surveillance, although it's exactly right that we have this sort of like panopticon like level of surveillance in factories, most workplace surveillance begins actually in trains, in buses, in and in trucks, right? Again, precisely because you don't have a manager sitting there in the cab of the truck or the locomotive of the train, like watching everything that the conductor or the driver is doing, right? So to some extent, that's like gives us a different sort of story of workplace or history of workplace surveillance. So it's in long haul trucking that we have, on the one hand, the development of these really intense forms of like surveillance and technological management, through like, everything from speed generators to cameras and things that like monitor your pupils to make sure you're still awake, things like that, right? Well, at the same time, long haul trucking is also a profession that, in the American imaginary in particular, has always been associated with like freedom and independence and this sort of like almost like a kind of non-capitalist, non-wage labor relationship, right? And I think we see something really similar in contemporary gig work. But I think that again, like I think gig workers themselves, even though they may prefer this form of labor for the fact that it lets them like build their own schedule, I think that they're becoming increasingly aware of the ways in which they're like intensely controlled by the algorithm and by the app. In part because, and I talk to when I do rideshare, which I try not to do very much, but I do sometimes. I always ask them about this, like they're very aware that you have to really know how the algorithm works and how the app works in order to make sure that you can make as much money as possible. Like if you're not understanding at least some piece of that, what gets black boxed from you, how it works, like what kind of rides are the best rides to pick up, right? Like where to wait, things like that. If you're not doing that all the time, you're going to get completely screwed by the app. I mean, you're going to get screwed anyway, but you're going to get even more screwed if you're not aware of how the algorithm is basically like managing you, and managing your choices. So I think gig workers are becoming more and more aware of that. And I think the other thing to say is that, like, for many gig workers, and I think this is increasingly true, the reason that they're sort of choosing gig work is again not out of free choice, but because they are, for one reason or another, barred from other forms of formal employment, right? So often that has to do with people who are formerly incarcerated or have some kind of prison record, or people who are recent immigrants, and maybe don't have citizenship status or don't have work permits. And you can see, particularly in big cities like New York, the ways in which this sector is really taking advantage of both of those groups of people and essentially building this entire labor market around the presumption that you have people who have literally no other option.
It's an important thing about undocumented and documented immigrants, as well as um, the punitive way in which we handle incarceration. I mean, for any reason. I mean, uh, I know plenty of people who can't get formal employment outside of three sectors. One sector, which is very bad for you if you have a substance problem, which a lot of incarcerated people do. That's why they got incarcerated in the first place. Um, but the sectors are gig work, meat packing,
Yeah.
and there's a reason why meat packing, because the work conditions in meat packing are still pretty horrible, even for industrial employment. Um, and piecemeal work and things like show rigging, day labor,
Yeah.
stuff like that, which is also dangerous and also full of substances. So, often if you're like trying to keep clean and straight and narrow, your best option is gig work.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
um, I do think this, your book got me thinking about this a lot. I recently wrote about myself where we started talking about uh we were trying to like reconceptualize and destigmatize the concept of lumping, because it's a kind of incoherent concept, really. um and we started thinking about it as a verb, and this was what we were
Yeah.
thinking about too, is like all these people in semi uh not really gray market anymore, although in the past they would have been, uh we might call semi-employed, because they have a job, but they technically are self-employed, but they aren't really self-employed in any meaningful sense.
Yeah.
Um, the tax burden is on them. I mean, one thing I was trying to explain to somebody is like, well, the cost of doing taxes for a lot of blue collar service workers has gotten exponentially higher, because they pretty much have to hire a CPA, because
Yeah.
they'll get destroyed in loopholes and whatnot if they don't. Um, because they are treated like a business, even though they're not. And they're not treated like a business in a way that would help them.
Right.
um,
Right.
um, because there are many ways in which being a business would make dealing with taxes a lot easier. They're only treated like a business in ways that would hurt them on the tax floor. So, uh, how much of this outsourcing of social cost and like reproduction costs, not just the obvious stuff like services, just trying to live your daily life, but also like stuff to do your job, is thrown back
Mhm.
on these services and not accounted in like the costs that they have to forego themselves?
Yeah, I think that's really important. And it's particularly important because another version of the sort of like online discourse about service workers that will occasionally show up is a claim like, well, gig workers are not working class or not proletariat because they own the means of production, right? Because they own their car. So they're basically like, they're like peasants or petty proprietors of some kind, right? Not like members of the working class, which I think is like insane, right? So it seems important to me on the one hand to like, acknowledge the fact exactly as you said that like these are workers who are having to provide the tools and the sort of machines of their own labor. But that does not make them like similar to like an independent artisan running their own shop, right? Like in fact, often, like, a lot of gig workers now are like getting loans to purchase the cars or purchasing the car insurance through the gig work company itself, right? So in the same way that like, in that period of like immense expansion of debt financing, like we got to a point where GM was making more money on loaning people money to buy cars than it was on the cars themselves. You have something similar happening with the gig work companies where they're making a lot of money loaning people money to buy the cars to do the job, right? And so I think like understanding the ways in which that's another way that like some of the sort of the like what we might call like the fixed capital burden for the service sector gets passed on to workers, as well as the wage fund getting passed on to workers. And so I think like thinking about that becomes really important to understanding like, I don't know, like the vulnerability of the potential vulnerability of these industries. Like they really depend on that. Like the idea that Uber and Lyft could even exist if they had to classify workers as employees and pay them under sort of like traditional labor regulations in the United States, they would immediately crumble. They would immediately crumble. They cannot exist because although they are very profitable, their profit margins depend on a specific set of like what are basically socio-political circumstances. Like they are not independently profitable. They do not work independent of those socio-political circumstances. And so I think again, like, there's something very dystopian about this situation, but they also suggests the capacity of sort of organized movements among these workers to really like put an immense amount of pressure on these companies and on this sector as a whole.
Well, my response is when people try to say that about gig workers is as I'm like, one, in factories in the late 19th century, you often had to own your tools anyway.
Yeah.
And two, uh um can you do the work without getting on the platform?
No, the platform
No.
is the means of production. Like clearly the
Right.
platform is the thing, right? The car is incidental in some ways, right? No, it's the platform that matters.
But it is amazing that I'm like, people don't talk about this. I'm like, oh yeah, these Uber drivers, these Lyft drivers, these DoorDash drivers, they're making between, in my area, they can turn they can turn less than minimum wage to about $15 an hour, not factoring in the damage to their vehicle,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
immense.
Yeah. And
Because most,
gas, right? I mean,
right.
especially now, right? Like fuel. Yeah.
Yeah. And yes, you can say, oh, well, they'll get that back on taxes. I'm like, okay, if the mileage rate that year actually reflects the fuel cost, maybe, but
Yeah.
also that's from the government at the end of the year. That's like
Yeah.
um uh one of the things I liked about your book though is that, okay, this can all sound very dry and about as fun as reading a Bureau of Labor Statistics article, which I enjoy, but I know most people don't. You actually use a fascinating array of cultural texts to get the qualitative part of this across to people in the book. You include novels by Uber drivers. You talk about reality television a lot. You kind of map out through supplementary media artifacts like a landscape of the service economy as represented to the public. um, what do these cultural representations do to capture what you need your audience to understand about this work? What does it say about the intimacy and also hostility of service work? And why did you feel the need to include it in your book?
Yeah, that's a great question. Sometimes I can like talk about this book for forever and not ever mention that there's like all this culture involved. And people often are sort of like, why is an English professor writing this labor history? But in fact, yeah, culture is like really important to the book and to how I sort of like initially came to be interested in the topic. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple things. Like one is again that it seems to me that contemporary pop culture in particular, like sort of gives the lie to that like Arlie Hochschild claim about the sort of like false consciousness of service workers, right? Like if you look at even these sort of like trashy reality TV shows about service workers that I find so fascinating, it's very clear that these workers are like incredibly aware of like what they're doing, why they're doing it, and that it is pure performance, and that there's no sense that like these the emotions that they're like the sort of affection for customers that they're performing or interest in customers' lives, like it's all totally fake and they're totally aware of it. And so in some ways it seems to me funny that like this sort of reality TV gets things right that the sociology of labor itself can't quite get right. Um, but then I'm also interested in the ways that these texts often like do express like, I mean, exactly as you said, like a kind of hostility, a sense of anger, a sense of again sort of like deep and abiding awareness of the conditions of super exploitation. Like you find that in the second chapter I look at these poems that are written by these clerical micro workers who are being hired by conceptual artists in the overdeveloped world to write poems as part of these sort of like conceptual art projects. And the point of those art projects is often like, oh, isn't this an interesting idea that I had to hire these workers to write poems for 5 cents a poem or whatever, and nobody actually reads the poems because that's not the point. But if you actually read the poems, you find this incredible documentation of sort of like proletarian experience, including in the underdeveloped world, in the sort of third world where a lot of these workers are working. And again, like a really vivid account of what it's like to perform this kind of work that I think is not that different from the kind of proletarian poetry that's produced in the late 19th century by piece rate seamstresses, for instance, as often as part of like organized labor movements or sort of like public awareness movements. And then in the final chapter with looking at these like novels written often by former gig workers, current and former gig workers, I think you can see again this effort to sort of think through that sort of like dialectical contradiction or paradox that we identified before around like what does it mean on the one hand to want the sort of freedom of the open road that comes with delivery work and the transportation of people, and on the other hand to recognize that that is like this fiction that's been cooked up by the companies to exploit you. And so it seems to me that like these cultural objects often allow us to hold sort of multiple things in our head at once in ways that that other other forms of documentation that are more quantitative, that are more empirical, don't let us do, right? Because they tend to be less open to sort of like, yeah, paradox and contradiction and complexity.
Mm. Yeah, I find it very useful because I also can be very much like talking about this all in terms of structures and stats and all that. And I have to remind myself I've lived a lot of this. I've been a service
Yeah.
worker. I used to work in an insurance company where part of my job was to ferret out who was a pizza delivery driver so we could make them get commercial insurance. But I was, even at the time I had already worked at a pizza. I was a assistant manager at a pizza shop, and I'd already been like, why aren't we providing these people with commercial insurance? We're asking them for private insurance, but it's illegal. Like we have an entire sector that everyone just accepts that ubiquitously at that time
Yeah.
was engaging in an illegal practice. I was like,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and I was like, this is weird. And so I try, like, I liked your stuff for reminding me, oh yeah, this is not just something I approach when I read
Yeah.
statistics. um One thing that to talk about this in also a very weird way, and in another seemingly paradoxical way, is you trace the history of service work back to the 1700s with domestic servants, and not only does that illustrate what we've already been talking about for an hour, that it's not a new phenomenon at all, but also that it's deeply racialized and gendered. And this has expressed itself in the US economy in deeply paradoxical ways, because these categories of labor are with the exception of like teachers and nurses, who I still think are exploited, but relative to everything else, um, are super exploited parts of capital, but also get reported on often strangely from, I can think of a very specific book that I mention a lot. Hannah Rosen's The End of Men, which came out of the Great Recession, a book that I have a very ambivalent relationship to. But that also made it sound like that due to automation, primarily, not outsourcing, a lot of male employment had disappeared after the Great Recession. So there's now resentment at these service workers twice
Mhm.
because they're seen as having a job where a lot of men don't. Um, this is also very shows up in racialization, because outside of municipal service work, where the Civil Rights Act was actually enforced, um, yeah, there's lots of ways to get around civil rights legislation, and so like you know, BIPOC, but particularly Black, and Latin people are often forced into the services if they can't get a municipal job. Um, and Now that's true of everybody, because usually what happens to the marginalized eventually happens to most categories of society, except for the wealthy. But I think it's important to look at that and talk about that because of the association with uh, gender. And I'll tell you one that cuts deep. I'm a teacher. I mean, my day job is a high school teacher. Been a professor and a teacher off and on for a long time. Um, and I was talking to someone about like the need to recruit specifically primary teachers who are men, and there was a lot of pushback. Oh, they don't want to do it. Oh, they want to do it. And then I was like, okay, but how many of you would think it would be weird for a man to want this job? And almost everybody raised their hands, and including relatively progressive people. And I'm like, what does that tell you sociologically? Because you
Yeah.
assume if a man wants to be a caregiver, they're a predator, particularly with children. And we all, I mean, I do it too, I hate to say, have this as an imago in our head.
Yeah.
Um, so this gendered and racialized nature with this work, I think today is also running flat into um, automation, and with the exception of the gig work driver that we've talked a lot about, most of these positions are considered female positions.
Yeah.
Um, uh, how does this paradox play out today? Like, do you think it leads us? Is that part of why we don't take these fields of work seriously enough? Is there a gender bias here?
Yeah.
And also, how do we overcome? Because we've talked about this in the need for primary education, because actually we've had issues with boys in primary education for a while. It's well studied. It's kind of agreed upon, and there's talk about the demand uh, for for incorporating more male teachers, and yet even people who say this still have these sociological stereotypes in their head, and it's deep in our socialization and habitats. Uh, how do you think we should handle that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, yeah, I mean, I hadn't really thought about, I mean, there's this, very interesting history. I mean, again, you can look back to like debates around the Fair Labor Standards Act and the choice to exclude domestic service from the act, and the ways in which that was like very clearly, very explicitly built on all of the sort of assumptions and anxieties that emerge around the fact that like 80% of those performing domestic service in the US when the Fair Labor Standards Act is written are Black women, right? And like
Mm-hmm.
you can see the ways in which one of the sort of alibis often given for like not regulating service work or not paying it formal wages or not paying it even living wages, let alone a family wage, is that it's somehow like natural to women and to people of color. You can see this again in the tradition of domestic service and the sort of postbellum period. You can see it in the ways in which the importation of like migrant women into the US beginning in the 60s through various schemes to bring in basically care workers into the US. The fact that like particularly informalized care workers, home health care workers, et cetera, still tend to be women, and particularly women of color. Like there's a long history where the sort of degradation of these forms of work is intimately tied to its racialization and its feminization. But I think you're also pointing to something interesting about like the present, which is that it turns out that a lot of these jobs, particularly again, those sort of like semi-professionalized ones like teachers and nurses are the most protected from both automation and outsourcing, right? And so then, like, what does it do to have a situation where these jobs that have historically been subject to degradation and feminization now look like, reasonable pathways to like, maybe a middle class income, and yet remain very feminized. And so it almost seems to me that, like, there's something about that discourse about like the anxiety about having men do these jobs that like almost feels like a sort of compensatory mechanism to accommodate the fact that like men are sort of trapped between these two facts, right? One is that these are forms of work that have historically been feminized and not and treated as natural to women, and treated as thus as like and been underwaged and informal. And on the other hand, they're maybe the best jobs that are still available in an economy that is getting worse and worse, right? A labor force that's getting worse and worse. And so it seems to me that maybe some of this like language about men as predators sort of emerges out of that contradiction as a way to sort of like navigate it. But of course, that basically, as you said, it fails everybody
Yeah.
equally.
I mean, this is what I've been really thinking about, because I watched some discourse about, oh, men would rather do X than teach, and I'm like, well,
Right.
also we won't hire them because we don't trust them, and
Yeah.
people are like, what? And I'm
Yeah.
like, no, it's just true. Like
Yeah.
it's illegal, but it doesn't. And I'm like, well, let's parse the sociology of this for a second. And the other thing that I think gets missed in this is like, yes, these are jobs, and yes, some of them that we might call them like the higher tier end of the service sector, teaching and nursing in particular, have enough union representation, enough dependent on frankly taxation, so we're not as vulnerable to recessions unless the property values fall, than we are. Um, but these jobs for a lot of people are very hard to do.
Yeah.
Teaching and nursing have an extremely high attrition rate because of
Yeah.
the conditions of labor. It's not because of the pay. I mean, like, the pay is not amazing, but that's not why people quit most of the time. Like,
Yeah.
despite what
Yeah.
people think, it's not usually why. It's that they're devalued. And devalued is usually coded for feminized. It's that they are they have all of them have high amounts of uncompensated labor associated with them, even if the compensation is good. And a lot of them, teaching nursing in particular, are in a hostile middle environment, navigating
Mhm.
the classes and people that they serve, but also multiple levels of stakeholders with wildly different interests. And that's true for the top end. When you look at like gig workers, like the number of people they have to appease is somewhat astounding to think about. Like, okay, so they got to appease their algorithmic managers, they got to appease the other customer, they they have to appease any number of people who have to service their stuff. I think this is just uh increasingly problematic, in the sense that also, like, if you look at a declining wage pool, you start wondering, like, well, how can the working class continue to support itself if the working class is directly, as petty consumers, directly subsidizing gig work and whatnot. And right now what's happening is a K-shaped economy phenomenon where increasingly they're just not, and things that used to
Mhm.
be services geared towards the statistical average person who's a worker are now geared towards relative elites, because that's the only market that really has the money to engage in it at all.
Yeah.
Do you think that will get people to start caring about this sector? If not the numbers, I mean, to me, it's like, okay, so you want to talk about like reforms and revolution, and you're talking about using as your only base 8% of the population that just in increasingly atomized areas of the country. I just like it just seems like such a weird self-limitation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh and it's just like anyone who's serious, particularly if they're a socialist or a Marxist of some kind, but I mean progressives too, really do need to think about this in a pretty deep way, I think.
Yeah.
Um
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, yeah, so like two things come to mind. One is like, I mean, to your point about teachers and nurses, like I think one of the most interesting thing about those sectors is that again, we've typically perceived those sectors to be relatively immune to efficiency pressures, relatively immune to increased productivity, relatively immune to intense scientific management and rationalization, right? Relatively immune to de-skilling. But a lot of what's happening now is the use of all of those in those sectors, right? So whether that's like use of technology, use of various forms of like performance-based pay or piece rate pay in those sectors, intensifying, very much intensifying, like in universities, adjunct professors, but also this happens in clinical work as well. Use of piece rate pay, use of AI in those sectors, right? So the desire to squeeze just even marginal productivity and efficiency gains out of these sectors that have historically been understood as technologically stagnant is exactly the thing that's changing that experience of work that you're describing, right? Where like you have basically like enshittification or degradation of working conditions, even where compensation remains like relatively stable. um and I think that is what the result of that is the potential for like greater degrees of labor militancy in these portions of the service workforce that are historically unionized but maybe have not been quite as militant as they might become. um the other thing about the sort of question of like reproductive costs in a context of a shrinking wage pool, I think is like exactly what I'm sort of talking about near the end of the book, where I'm sort of saying like if you look at the way that like particularly in the 30s 40s 50s, this period of like high industrial growth, the way that industrial labor unions often made the case for wage gains was by tethering wage gains to increased productivity. So like the UAW has these famous contracts that they sign in the 40s where they basically tie compensation gains to increases in technological productivity, right, in ways that appear to serve like labor and capital equally. So it's like this amazing compromise position. You just are not going to have that in a service economy because productivity is not going to increase that way, right? And so you can't yoke your claims to the need for wage gains or your demands around wages to productivity. And so one of the things that I'm noting is that instead you have increasingly labor organizations as well as sort of more informal worker organizations thinking about making demands around cost of living, right? Making demands around housing costs in particular, forming alliances. Like SEIU is doing all this amazing work working with tenants unions on the East Coast. That just the existence of tenants unions in and of itself is, I think, a really interesting phenomenon. But the way that now labor unions and tenants unions are working together, as well as all of these service sector union and worker campaigns developing these kinds of like, again, like bargaining for the common good type demands. So not just talking about wages, but talking about immigrant rights to transportation or rights to trans workers, or often in public sector unions, like opposition to ICE or to police on campuses or in federal and state institutions. So all of these ways that like worker organizations and unions are coming up with a set of demands around reproduction, around the common good, that are very distinct from that industrial worker tradition that's going to just think about it in terms of like fair wages or like a right to the products of your labor, right? I think service worker unions and organizations are having to think very differently about that question.
I think that's a great point to kind of ask a final question, and it's something that we kind of started off with. But you mentioned coordination between tenants unions and traditional labor unions. I have also been uh, studying lately the structures of these unions. I'm a union rep at the teachers union, so I think a lot about this. But um, I've been thinking about tennis unions, which are great because they have a low barred entry, but they're difficult to get wins for because property owners can often actually forgo rents. They still have ways to valorize their value. But if you have enough pressure, you can actually do something about that. But the pressure thresholds are actually quite high. But if you coordinate with with more traditional unions, you do have a lot of power. There are, of course, some legal restrictions to that. Thank you, Taft Hartley. But I think we're going to have to be thinking about these in more coordinated ways, because I don't think the Marxist assumption that work centralization on an industrial level would go forever. Um, uh, uh, and I actually will say, I think Marx actually contradicts himself on this too, because there's stuff in Capital Volume 2 and 3 indicate that it won't. But when you hear them talk, they talk like it's going to, we're going to have infinite skilling because the increased centralization of labor and blah, 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 blah. That we really kind of have to just look at the reality is like, no, they figured out how to automate enough stuff that they don't need the centralized locations in the same way. And you're going to have a lot more service labor, and there's going to be a lot more pressures on that service labor because it's harder to squeeze productivity out of it by just, injecting fixed capital in. You got to be mean. Like seriously, there's really no other way to do it. And that has immense costs too. Immense costs for surveillance, immense costs for if we look at if we think about how much of the AI sector is actually about surveilling, and particularly surveilling workers, the costs of this are astronomical. They're just hidden.
Yeah.
So do you think these actually creates fracture points for organizing that we could actually use? Because there are high costs to this, and it requires a more and more invasive state, which nobody really likes.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, I think the surveillance point is really important because I do think, I mean, you can even see that like in, debates that are not directly related to labor questions at all, like state surveillance as part of like the, war on terror, right? Like that's actually like there's actually like far less political agreement across the spectrum on that than like we might think, right? Because people have a sort of gut reaction against it. But I also think like the point about like, I mean, for me, one of the ways I've tried to think about this is about thinking about like quality. And again, like, often when people talk about how like service work can't be automated or it can't be, its productivity can't be increased, what they really mean is that it can't be automated or it can't have its productivity increased without the thing that you're producing or the service that you're providing getting really shitty, right? Like,
right.
it's not that you can't, like, theoretically one person could watch 100 children or even 1,000 children. It's just that like probably some of those children will like fall off a cliff and die or whatever,
It's just
right?
we're just gonna have to have a certain marginal loss of kids.
Exactly. So it's like once you accept that, then actually you can increase the productivity of something like childcare, right? And so I think like what that means is that as workers in the service sector, we're going to have to make arguments that do have to do with this question of quality. And I think you can see that, like you can see nurses unions do that. You can certainly see teachers unions do that. And it's one of the arguments that I'm sort of trying to make at the end of the book in my own sector, higher ed, around like onlineification and the turn to more remote instruction in the sort of wake of the COVID pandemic, which is like this immense labor saving and sort of infrastructure cost, fixed capital cost saving thing that universities have discovered that they can do. It allows you to increase the number of students like exponentially, like far higher than would have seemed possible before. You don't even have to build a room to house them, right? You're doing it all online.
Fire
You have
codes
people
no
record.
longer matter. Like no.
Exactly. You can have a faculty member record their lectures and then you can have most of the class run by like an underpaid adjunct or graduate student, right? It's very cheap. And so part of what the argument that faculty or that teachers and other parts of the education sector are going to have to make is that like that's not simply a labor issue, it's also a quality issue. And so we're going to have to make arguments about the quality of the services that we're providing if we want to bring in some degree of like public support for the labor movements that we're creating, right? So in ways that like yeah they're going to look different, like you can in fact make like you can probably make you automate the manufacturing of cars the cars don't get worse, they actually get better, right? But that's not the case with the service sector. And so we're going to have to make an argument that has to do with like the importance of these as aspects of social reproduction that everybody should care about, rather than just an argument that has to do with the labor conditions of people who work in that sector.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about this when I was reading your book, and then I'd recently read Cory Doctorow's book on acidification, and I was like, well, Doctor O, this is all great and it's all true, but what you're not putting together is this is industrialization applied to things that it doesn't work for. Because
Precisely.
yes, Taylorism does make better cars in that like the parts are consistent and you can measure them and you can fix them, and every now and then they'll do something like a Pinto and it'll kill a bunch of people, but for the most part it doesn't do that. Whereas when you do that in my job, I now work in a half online program, and we go like I've discovered to make an online program work in a public school system, I have to go and meet with kids all the time and do all that stuff. But without that component, I don't know they're learning anything.
Yeah.
And but the district sees this as a way to be like, oh, we can cut down, we can deal with our we don't not necessarily even getting rid of teachers, but like we've been understaffed since 2007, like since the Great Recession and the reduction of workforce at that time. The teaching field has been perpetually between 15 and 20% understaffed, and they've been relying on these technological gains and basically declining birth rates to fix the problem because they weren't going to fix it any other way. Eventually, the cost of social reproduction got so high they actually started having to pay us more. But again, as I was pointing out to people like, "Oh, I'm super grateful." It's like adjust for inflation.
Yeah. Right.
Like
And just vanishes. It vanishes.
it's
Right.
it's like we are pacing inflation. Like
Right. Yeah.
like
Yay. Right. Yeah.
admit in this economy it might be doing good to pace inflation, but we are pacing inflation. We are not actually making that much more money. And yeah, my bosses love hate me because they're not used to a teacher who actually understands economics. But
Dangerous. Dangerous.
yeah, it is. They particularly won't let me teach it. But it's one of these things that I've seen a lot about. And your book was like it hit a core because I was like, we really need to talk about this because the debates around this, the 19th century debates are somewhat excusable. They're still kind of dumb, but they're somewhat excusable. The 20th century debates seem to me like you're sticking your head in the ground.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Like, one, I don't think we really want 1950s factories to come back. And if we brought manufacturing back, which everyone's been promising and no one can do because secretly we were still manufacturing a lot anyway, they just don't employ that many people. You know, the shop size has shrunk from like 5,000 to like 250 for the same amount of productivity. I don't know what we can do. So we have to focus on the service sector because otherwise, and I do think you're right. And I also think that's how you get the back of the public on this, because the one thing has been hard about organizing in services before is when we strike, we're very effective in some ways because we shut stuff down, but also we hurt more than our bosses.
Yeah.
And so it's easy to have the rest of the public get mad at us. So like when we're like, hey, we're doing this so you don't get complete shit.
Yeah.
Seems to be an important argument. Anyway.
Yeah.
I'm really excited about your book. Obviously, it's out from Zone. Yeah, this Zone. And it's been out for I think a couple months now. It definitely be a couple months by the time I release this. I'd like to thank you for your time. Where can people find your work if they're interested in following what you do?
You can find, I have a website, anniejmcclanahan.com, and you can find links to all my work there.
Sweet. Thank you so much. I'll put the link in the show notes. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks.
Bye.